The John Denver mystery finally solved, and isn't good. Beloved for his gentle songs and clean-cut image, John Denver's final flight ended in disaster. But beneath the surface were FAA violations, a revoked pilot license, and emotional turmoil few knew about. The story of his death and what led to it is far darker than fans were told. On October 12, 1997, the Pacific Ocean mirrored the sky above, calm, boundless, and blue. A perfect day for a pilot to soar. At 5:28 p.m., the radio at Monterey Peninsula Airport crackled with a final voice. "Do you have it now?" It was the last thing anyone would ever hear from John Denver. Just a minute later, witnesses on the ground saw a strange movement. His small, long, easy aircraft banking steeply before plummeting into the waves like a stone dropped from the heavens. No mayday call, no chance to recover, just a sudden, eerie silence, and a man beloved by millions, gone in an instant. To the world, John Denver was the bard of American beauty, a warm voice that sang of sunshine, country roads, mountain highs, and the simple, aching nostalgia for home. But behind the gold records and folksy charm was a soul caught between earth and sky. His final moments, alone in a fragile, experimental aircraft with a known fuel system flaw, were the tragic culmination of decades of ambition, obsession, and overlooked warnings. The headlines broke the next day. John Denver dies in plane crash off California coast. For most fans, the shock was immediate and incomprehensible. How could the man who brought peace through music be taken in such a violent, preventable way? But as investigators combed through the wreckage, what they found was more than mechanical failure. It was a story of risk, rule-breaking, and haunting ironies. The mystery that lingered after Denver's death wasn't if he crashed. It was why. The National Transportation Safety Board would later conclude that Denver had likely lost control of his aircraft while trying to switch fuel tanks mid-flight. The plane's fuel selector valve, bizarrely positioned behind the pilot's left shoulder, required him to twist around, unstrap his harness, and take his hand off the controls. It was an accident waiting to happen, and Denver, despite knowing the risks, climbed in that cockpit anyway. But to understand how he ended up there, we have to rewind. Before the aviation mishaps, before the fame, before the congressional hearings and the Emmy-winning specials, we have to go back to the quiet, rootless boy from Roswell, New Mexico, born Henry John Deutschendorf Jr., a kid raised in the shadow of jet engines, discipline, and silence. The story of John Denver isn't just a cautionary tale about aviation. It's the chronicle of a man torn between two loves, the music of the mountains and the thrill of the sky. His lyrics often carried a kind of spiritual weight, a search for belonging, but his real life, rife with isolation, failed marriages, legal troubles, and inner turmoil, rarely reflected the peace he sang about. He wasn't just a celebrity, he was a symbol, a man whose very name, Denver, evoked fresh air, open spaces, and alpine purity. But like the thin air atop a Colorado peak, fame had its own dangers. And beneath Denver's outward calm ran a relentless need to escape, to ascend. Whether through music, flight, or even space exploration, he was always reaching for something just out of grasp. It's no wonder then that when he learned about NASA's civilian spaceflight program, he jumped at the chance. Denver passed their rigorous physical and psychological screenings and nearly became the first civilian in space aboard the Challenger. The only reason he didn't go was NASA chose a teacher instead. That teacher, Krista McAuliffe, would die just seconds into flight in the Challenger explosion. The close call haunted Denver for the rest of his life. Saved by rejection, spared by fate, but not for long. The man who once sang, "I'd rather be a hammer than a nail," was both in the end, driven, purposeful, and broken by forces beyond his control. His story doesn't just end in tragedy, it crashes there, scattered in salt water and memory. But along the way, it offers a powerful reflection of what it means to search for peace in a world that rarely gives it freely. For many, John Denver's voice is still a lullaby for lost times. But this story, this is not just about a voice. It's about what happens when that voice belongs to a man who could never quite stay grounded. Before he was John Denver, he was Henry John Deutschendorf Jr., a boy growing up under the roar of jet engines and the watchful eyes of military discipline. Born on December 31, 1943, in Roswell, New Mexico, his life began amid the stark beauty of the American Southwest and the rigid expectations of an Air Force household. His father, Lieutenant Colonel Henry John Deutschendorf Sr., was a decorated pilot and flight instructor whose presence loomed large in the young boy's life. Denver's earliest memories were shaped not by roots, but by relocation. The Air Force moved the Deutschendorfs constantly. New Mexico, Oklahoma, Alabama, Arizona, Texas. There was no such thing as a childhood bedroom that stayed the same. No lifelong friends, no town to call home. The result was a boy often quiet, inward, uncertain. In school, he was shy to the point of invisibility. Always the new kid, always starting over. But amid the upheaval, there were quiet refuges. One of them was his grandmother's farm in Oklahoma. It was there, among wide fields and creaky porches, that young John was first exposed to country music. Hank Williams, the Carter Family, Woody Guthrie. Songs that told simple truths in 3 chords. Music that sounded like belonging. Then came a gift that changed everything. An antique Gibson guitar, handed to him by another grandmother when he turned 11. The moment he held it, something shifted. The awkward boy who rarely spoke above a whisper found his voice, not in conversation, but in melody. He taught himself to play, stumbling at first, then growing more confident. That guitar wasn't just a hobby. It was his anchor, his therapy, his introduction to identity. He joined the Tucson, Arizona Boys Chorus, where he began learning harmony, performance, and the joy of singing with others. By high school, music had become his quiet rebellion against the structure of military life. He began performing folk songs at school events and local venues, finding solace in ballads that let him say what he couldn't speak. But his relationship with his father remained strained. The elder Deutschendorf valued order, achievement, and obedience, qualities that didn't match his son's dream of playing guitar for a living. He couldn't understand the yearning his son had to chase something ephemeral, something impractical. Their bond would remain complicated for decades. Even as he grew famous, he would still carry the weight of never quite measuring up. Still, Denver's spirit persisted. At Texas Tech University in Lubbock, he initially pursued architecture, perhaps a nod to practicality, but quickly realized his passion lay elsewhere. He joined a group called the Alpine Trio, sharpening his vocal range and songwriting instincts. It was in those smoky cafes and college town gatherings that John began turning raw emotion into performance, using music not just as self-expression, but as communion. He was good, not flashy, but deeply affecting. Audiences listened, and slowly he began to believe what they heard, that he had something to say, that maybe his voice, so small in childhood, could echo across something bigger. Then came the moment that revealed how determined he really was. In a burst of impulsive hope, he ran away to California, chasing the faint promise of a music career. He didn't make it far. His father tracked him down in Fort Worth and brought him home. But the runaway act was a signal flare. It said, "This isn't a phase." It said, "I will find a way." And he did. He dropped out of Texas Tech. He packed up his dreams and moved to Los Angeles. He changed his name, not just to escape the burden of Deutschendorf, but to become someone new. John Denver, chosen in honor of the Colorado capital he loved. It sounded like clarity, like blue skies and open roads, like the start of something real. In the end, the shy boy with the guitar didn't become a rock star overnight, but the seeds were planted. In dorm rooms and deserts, in songs shared with strangers, in lonely walks and quiet strums. His transformation had begun. Some biographers still debate whether John's early struggles with isolation were the source of his empathy or the root of his lifelong search for meaning. What's clearer is this: his music was born from a longing to belong, and that longing came from a boy who'd moved too often, spoken too little, and finally found a language all his own. In a time when most teenagers were finishing high school and dreaming about prom, John Denver was planning an escape. He wasn't running from danger or rebellion. He was running towards something: music, freedom, a voice of his own. It was 1961, and the 17-year-old had made up his mind. California held the key to his future. He never made it. His father, the seasoned Air Force pilot with a radar for insubordination, intercepted him before he reached Fort Worth. Lieutenant Colonel Deutschendorf didn't yell, he didn't punish. He simply flew out, retrieved his son, and brought him back into the fold. But what Denver's father didn't realize at the time was his son had already taken flight, emotionally, creatively, spiritually. His body may have returned home, but his soul was now permanently tuned to a different. By 1973, John Denver wasn't just rising, he was soaring. His albums were charting high, his name was becoming a household fixture, and his songs were burrowing deep into American hearts. But unlike many of his musical peers who leaned on rebellion or flamboyance, Denver's ascent was built on something far quieter: comfort, reliability, sincerity. In a world reeling from war, scandal, and cultural upheaval, his voice felt like a blanket in winter. Take Me Home Country Roads had cracked the door, but it was Rocky Mountain High that blew it open. Released as a single in late 1972 and as part of the album of the same name, Rocky Mountain High was more than just a charting success. It was a declaration of Denver's identity. It immortalized his spiritual connection to Colorado, drawing inspiration from camping trips, stargazing, and the profound silence of mountain wilderness. He was singing the state's anthem before it ever became official, one journalist later wrote. And in 2007, the state of Colorado made it official indeed, naming Rocky Mountain High one of its 2 state songs. Denver's career blossomed into a golden age through the early and mid-1970s. Album after album, Back Home Again, Wind Song, and Evening with John Denver, each debuted with strong sales, showcasing his unique ability to blend folk, pop, and country in ways that transcended genres. He wasn't tied down by musical borders. He could sell out a show in Nashville one night and Carnegie Hall the next. In 1974, he delivered a string of hits that cemented his reputation as one of the era's most beloved artists. Sunshine on My Shoulders reached #1, a slow, gentle ballad that captured the purest of pleasures: light, warmth, and the longing for peace. That same year, Andy's song, written for his wife Annie Martell while riding a ski lift, became a cultural phenomenon. It reached the top of the charts in both the US and the UK, its lyrics so simple and honest that it became a fixture at weddings and a favorite for orchestras to reinterpret. By 1975, he hit another high point with Thank God I'm a Country Boy, an exuberant, fiddle-driven romp that showcased Denver's sense of humor and stage charisma. That same year, I'm Sorry also topped the Billboard Hot 100, revealing a more vulnerable side and proving that he could still strike emotional gold. 4 #1 singles in just over 18 months. For any artist, it would have been an extraordinary feat. For John Denver, a man once told his last name was too complicated to make it in show business, it was vindication. But what made Denver's success even more remarkable was that it never relied on scandal or controversy. His image was pure, his lyrics almost universally family-friendly, his concerts free of wild antics. While others chased edginess, John doubled down on authenticity. His charisma wasn't explosive, it was gentle, the kind that didn't fade once the applause stopped. TV networks caught on. In 1975, Denver became a fixture on television, appearing in specials and variety shows. The John Denver Show aired to strong ratings. He won an Emmy for An Evening with John Denver, and his personality, genuine, warm, and just self-deprecating enough, made him a favorite on talk shows. He wasn't just selling records, he was becoming America's musical conscience. Yet as he filled arenas and won awards, a different dream quietly intensified behind the scenes. While most fans knew Denver as a songwriter and storyteller, fewer understood the deep-seated obsession that had shadowed his life since childhood: Flight. John had been raised in the presence of airplanes, thanks to his father's distinguished military aviation career. But in the 1970s, aviation became more than a hobby for Denver. It became a second identity. He earned his pilot's license, purchased his own aircraft, and often used them to travel between concerts and appearances. His plane became an extension of himself, his cockpit a place of quiet solitude amidst the noise of fame. He spoke about flying with the same reverence he reserved for music. "It's where I feel closest to the stars," he once said. The thrill of takeoff, the meditative stillness of gliding, the silence above the clouds. It all fed his need to escape the increasingly crowded world he had built on Earth. That passion for flight soon collided with his rising profile as an environmentalist and adventurer. He began advocating not only for the protection of forests and wildlife, but also for space exploration. His name was even floated as a candidate for NASA's Teacher in Space program, something he took seriously, undergoing the physical and psychological tests to qualify. He passed, but he was ultimately not chosen. The mission he had dreamed of joining was the Space Shuttle Challenger in 1986. When the shuttle exploded 73 seconds after launch, killing all 7 crew members, including Krista McAuliffe, Denver was devastated. He had been spared by a narrow margin, but haunted all the same. The tragedy deepened his already complicated relationship with aviation. He saw flight not just as joy, but as fate, unpredictable, beautiful, and dangerous. But he continued to fly. He continued to sing. But the two passions, one rooted in earth, the other in the sky, were now pulling him in opposite directions. Some historians still debate whether John Denver's need for escape, be it into nature, fame, or the clouds, was born from the solitude of childhood or the weight of unexpected stardom. What's certain is that by the late 1970s, he was living 2 lives: the grounded troubadour of country roads and the airborne dreamer chasing the horizon. And one day, that second life would overtake the first. To most of the world, John Denver was the voice of mountain valleys and country highways. But to those who knew him well, or those who followed the flicker in his eye when he spoke of airspeed and thermals, he was something else entirely. A pilot first, a musician second. Flying wasn't just a pastime for Denver. It was the great metaphor of his life, and eventually, it became its defining tension. Denver's obsession with aviation was hardly surprising. His father, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Deutschendorf Sr., was a titan in the skies, a decorated Air Force pilot and one of the first to break the sound barrier. The shadow cast by that legacy was long. Growing up around airfields, hangars, and air shows, John absorbed the mechanics and majesty of flight the way other kids learned to ride bikes. While music let him express his soul, flying made him feel weightless, untethered from the expectations of fame, family, and gravity itself. By the early 1970s, Denver was not only a licensed pilot, but a skilled one. He held certifications for single-engine land, multi-engine aircraft, single-engine seaplanes, and gliders. While most of his contemporaries traveled by tour bus, Denver crisscrossed the country in his own planes, Christian Eagles, Cessnas, and occasionally more exotic craft. To him, piloting wasn't a luxury, it was sacred. He once said that flying made him feel as free as the music he sang. And he wasn't just flying for transportation or thrill. Denver embraced aviation with the same intensity he gave his songs. He studied flight mechanics, he practiced gliding techniques, he perfected engine-out landings and emergency descent procedures. He was known to shut off his engine mid-flight just to test his ability to glide to safety. Friends and instructors admired his calm and precision, but some privately feared he was pushing the edge. Quote, "He treated the cockpit like a cathedral," one friend later recalled, "but he also tested fate more than most," unquote. As his music career reached its peak in the mid-1970s, Denver began to infuse his songs with the spirit of aviation. Tracks like Flying for Me and The Eagle and the Hawk carried not only the rhythm of air currents, but the romantic symbolism of escape, height, and release. In concert, he spoke often about the sky, how it gave him peace, how it made him feel small in the best way. Flying for Denver was an antidote to fame. A cockpit didn't ask for autographs, the sky made no demands. But it was a controlled freedom. He was methodical with pre-flight checks, detailed in logbooks. His aviation routine reflected the same discipline he applied to songwriting. He knew the risks, he respected the machines, and still, he flirted with danger. Then came the space dream. In the early 1980s, NASA launched the Teacher in Space program, a bold initiative to put a civilian educator aboard the space shuttle. Denver, ever the optimist and explorer, submitted his name for consideration. It wasn't a stunt. He approached the process with the same intensity he gave to songwriting, flying, and activism. He submitted documentation, passed mental and physical screenings, and met all the medical standards for spaceflight. NASA took him seriously. His fame, piloting experience, and clean public persona made him a compelling candidate, someone who could speak to Americans from classrooms to Capitol Hill. But NASA wasn't looking for a celebrity. They were looking for a teacher, and in the final stages, they selected Krista McCulloch, a high school educator from New Hampshire. Denver was disappointed, but gracious. He later said he understood the decision and would support the mission with all his heart. That support came with a chilling cost. On January 28, 1986, John Denver sat among millions of viewers watching the live launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger. Only 73 seconds into flight, the shuttle exploded in midair. All 7 astronauts aboard were killed, including Krista McCulloch. Denver had watched from the ground. He wept openly. "It could have been me," he later confessed, with a mixture of sorrow and disbelief. The near miss shook him to his core. Though he was no stranger to the risk. October 12, 1997. Monterey Bay was calm. The sun hung low in the California sky, its golden reflection dancing along the surface of the Pacific. It was the kind of afternoon John Denver might have written a song about. Serene, endless, quietly breathtaking. But for the man once known for romanticizing skies and whispering to the mountains, this day would mark his final descent. At 5:12 p.m., Denver's sleek, ivory-colored Rutan Long EZ lifted off from Monterey Peninsula Airport. He had performed 3 touch-and-go landings earlier, brief, controlled maneuvers often used for practice, and now he was airborne again, seemingly intending another lap over the coast. The aircraft, as experimental as it was eye-catching, glided smoothly into the sky. Everything appeared normal, until it wasn't. By the mid-1990s, John Denver had become an artist in twilight. The meteoric success of the 1970s, the gold records, sold-out stadiums, television specials, had receded into the rearview mirror. The radio waves no longer hummed with his voice daily. His albums weren't topping the charts. A newer generation, raised on grunge and hip-hop, hardly knew his name. But Denver wasn't fading quietly. He was evolving. He had long outgrown the shiny label of pop folk icon, and now, freed from the expectations of chart dominance, he refocused his energy on the causes closest to his heart, chief among them, the Earth itself. Environmentalism wasn't just a celebrity cause for Denver. It was woven into his very sense of identity. For years, he had championed nature conservation, clean energy, and sustainable living, often long before these issues became fashionable. In 1976, he co-founded the WinStar Foundation in Snowmass, Colorado, a nonprofit dedicated to promoting sustainable living and global environmental education. He poured money, time, and belief into the project, shaping it into a spiritual and ecological sanctuary. At WinStar, he hosted seminars and welcomed thinkers, farmers, politicians, and artists alike to reimagine humanity's relationship with nature. "If we don't learn to live in harmony with the Earth," he once said, "we're writing our own extinction." It wasn't just talk. He practiced what he preached, converting his home to solar power, driving fuel-efficient vehicles, and planting trees with his own hands. But it was also at WinStar that one could glimpse a quieter, more contemplative John Denver. He would take long solo walks through the forest trails, often in the early morning. Sometimes he'd bring a guitar, sometimes only silence. His friends began to describe him as gentler, more inward, and more searching.
That yearning, so present in his early songs, had never left him. If anything, it had grown sharper. In public, he still performed, though the venues were smaller, intimate theaters, university auditoriums, benefit shows. His fans remained devoted. They brought worn-out vinyl albums for him to sign. They told him his music had walked them through divorce, cancer, birth, and death, and he listened, always. "I'm not famous anymore," he joked at one small concert in 1996, "but I still get to sing." His later songs took on new shades, less sweeping grandeur, more pointed reflection. Tracks like Whispering Jesse, Love Again, and Let Us Begin, What Are We Making Weapons For, moved away from the country idealism of his youth and into deeper ethical and emotional terrain. His voice had aged, mellowed, but it still carried the weight of sincerity. Still, Denver was not immune to disappointment. Windstar's momentum began to falter by the mid-1990s, struggling with funding and leadership transitions. Environmental advocacy, once cutting edge, was being eclipsed in the media by flashier movements. He attempted to pivot Windstar into broader educational efforts, even considering a school, but the infrastructure wasn't there. His frustration was palpable. Privately, Denver also wrestled with the sting of cultural irrelevance. While peers like Bob Dylan and Neil Young had found new resonance in the shifting musical landscape, Denver often felt stranded between genres. He was too pop for country, too country for pop, and too earnest for irony-soaked 1990s culture. And yet, he never stopped creating. He continued to write songs, many of which remained unpublished. He sketched plans for a new album that would combine music with spoken-word reflections on spirituality and the environment. He dreamed of a film project, an autobiographical journey through the American West, intercut with stories from his childhood, music, and interviews with conservationists. It never materialized. What did materialize, however, was a growing tension between his internal peace and external pressures. Financial issues loomed. His second divorce had been costly. Legal fees from the DUIs, the revocation of his pilot's license, and declining music revenue all weighed heavily. He began flying more often. Whether to escape or recalibrate, no one could say for sure. What is certain is that aviation became his sanctuary again. He logged hours in his Cessna. He reconnected with the dream of spaceflight, speaking at private aerospace events. He even wrote letters to NASA proposing new outreach programs. He believed that music and science could heal together. He believed in a world that hadn't yet arrived. One close friend recalled a late-night conversation in Aspen during this period. He talked about legacy, not just songs, but what he would leave behind when he was gone. He wanted to be remembered as more than a musician. He wanted to be a teacher, a soul that had lived fully. That legacy was beginning to crystallize. A new generation of artists, from folk revivalists to singer-songwriters, quietly cited Denver as an influence. His songs were covered again, sampled, sung at weddings, played at funerals. There was a sense that even if the spotlight had dimmed, the warmth of his voice still lingered in the background of American life. Then came the Long EZ. The sleek, futuristic aircraft represented everything Denver loved: freedom, beauty, innovation. But it also carried risk, and Denver knew it. His request to modify the fuel valve placement hadn't been fulfilled. He lacked recent training in the craft, and he no longer had a valid pilot's medical certificate. But still, he flew. To those around him, it wasn't rebellion. It was inevitability. He needed to be in the skies, said a family friend. That's where he thought clearest. That's where the pain stopped. In the final weeks of his life, Denver gave no indication of despair. He smiled during his last public performances. He talked about writing again. He looked forward to future projects. But something else lingered too. A quiet, resigned serenity, as if he knew his story was reaching its final stanza. Perhaps that's why he didn't wait for the fuel valve to be moved. Perhaps he believed that to fly was always worth it, even if he didn't make it back down. And perhaps in some way, he was already ascending. The death of John Denver was, in every sense, a cultural rupture. It wasn't just the end of a musician's life, it was the shattering of an image. one that had been carefully cultivated, beloved, and perhaps partially mythologized. Denver had been the voice of harmony, a symbol of gentleness in a turbulent world. And yet his final chapter revealed something much more complicated, a man who had broken rules, defied authorities, and made fatal mistakes. The public response was immediate and raw. Fans around the world lit candles, played Rocky Mountain High on repeat, and flooded radio stations with requests and tearful tributes. In Colorado, the state he had helped enshrine in musical legend, a spontaneous gathering of thousands took place in Aspen. Flowers lined the streets. People brought guitars, singing his songs through their tears, as if to keep him from vanishing entirely. Yet, even as the mourning deepened, so did the questions. Was John Denver's death preventable? Absolutely. Could someone have stopped him from flying? Maybe. Should his legacy be reevaluated in light of his personal flaws? That, perhaps, is the most enduring question. The tension between the man and the myth has continued to ripple through cultural discourse. In interviews, aviation experts point to Denver's violations: flying without a license, failing to complete necessary safety modifications, and disregarding known hazards. They criticize the FAA's limited enforcement capacity regarding experimental aircraft and raised concerns about a broader culture of casual oversight among private pilots. He was warned, one flight instructor noted, and he chose to ignore those warnings. Others take a more sympathetic view. They see a man driven not by arrogance, but by yearning, a pilot not trying to skirt rules, but trying to hold on to the one thing that still made him feel whole. His fans remain fiercely loyal. In the years since his death, his music has seen a quiet resurgence. Take Me Home Country Roads has become one of the most streamed folk songs of all time. Andy's song remains a wedding favorite across generations. Rocky Mountain High is now taught in Colorado schools as part of the state's musical heritage. In 2007, a full decade after his death, the Colorado State Legislature officially named Rocky Mountain High one of the 2 official state songs. It wasn't just an honor, it was a formal recognition that Denver had shaped the identity of an entire region. West Virginia followed suit in 2014, declaring Take Me Home Country Roads as an official state anthem. Though Denver had no direct ties to the state, the song had become so deeply entwined with its cultural soul that lawmakers voted nearly unanimously in favor of an act. These acts of remembrance, both legislative and emotional, underscore a profound truth: that Denver's work transcended his failings, that his songs still connect, that they still matter. And yet, the conversation around his legacy is far from settled. Biographers have taken different approaches. Some choose to focus on his activism, his groundbreaking environmental work, his humanitarian efforts, and his relentless pursuit of beauty through music. Others delve into the messier truths: his alcohol arrests, his volatile relationships, and his fatal refusal to follow protocol. Some scholars argue that Denver's duality is exactly what makes him worth studying. One historian wrote, "He wasn't just a folk singer, he was a mirror of a generation's hopes, of a country's contradictions, of the struggle to be good when you're human." His story has since become a staple of documentaries and retrospectives. The 2013 BBC film
John Denver's life is a study in paradox, wildly successful, yet deeply solitary, revered for simplicity, yet tangled in complexity. He gave the world songs that felt like truth, even as his own life battled contradiction. In the end, he died doing what he loved, in the same sky he once described as his cathedral. The mystery of that final flight may never fully resolve, but his legacy doesn't rest in a cockpit. It lives in the chords and memories he left behind. He was never the loudest voice in the room, but he didn't need to be. In a time of growing noise, his music whispered something timeless about nature, about love, about coming home. That whisper still carries today, in the rustle of leaves, in the hush of mountains, in the soft hum of radios playing Sunshine on My Shoulders. So as we look back on his journey, from the boy in Roswell to the man in the sky, we see more than a singer, we see a seeker,
a witness to wonder, a flawed, passionate, remarkable human being who poured his heart into every verse. Let that be what endures. If this story moved you, if it made you reflect, sing, or feel, consider subscribing, sharing, or exploring more of our stories. There are many more lives worth revisiting and more echoes worth chasing. And for now, as Denver once sang, far out in the country, dreams can still come true.